The production of this video was made possible by donors to the Orchestration Online Patreon initiative. Please consider adding your support to the creation of free educational internet resources by visiting our Patreon page linked below.
Hey there, this is your orchestration tutor Thomas Goss, bringing you another preview from my upcoming book, 100 Last Orchestration Tips. This time covering the topic of trombones interacting with horns, in brass chorales, harmonic doubling, and melodic unison. This is an effect that one sees in many types of scoring, especially late Romantic era operas, huge post-Romantic tone poems, and epic film scores. In my first two books, I've touched on this relationship, particularly in the original 100 Orchestration Tips Chapter 45, Trombone Roles and Relationships. Now let's dive in for a more detailed look at how these two instruments work together in the best of circumstances, with a few cautions about balance, interdependency, and timbre. The best place to start is with a comparison between the ranges and registers of trombone versus horn. And we can see that the two share a nearly identical scope of pitches. The bottom four pedal tones are identical, from sounding G to B flat below the staff, followed by low, middle, and high registers across similar ranges of pitches, with those of the horn scaled a couple notes higher than the trombone. But both instruments, at least in general symphonic scoring, top out at high-sounding F, high-written C for horn, and tenor clef F for trombone. Admittedly, a more reasonable top note of E-flat is recommended for trombone, but I've included the high F, as some players can pop this out on their tenors for Beethoven's Fifth, but more and more are switching back over to the original alto trombone for this extreme note. With such close uniformity of registers, one might think that horn and trombone are pretty well matched for timbre and strength. But nothing could be further from the truth. The trombone's pedal tones are fierce, intense, and menacing, while the horns are more discreet and shallow sounding, and of course a fraction of the strength of trombone down there. The next half octave of trombone, representing its low range, while not as ideal as the same pitches on bass trombone, are still dark and fat, all the more so compared to the horn's low register, which is far less focused in timbre, with a kind of weaker, more gravelly sound. The middle registers are more aesthetically balanced, though, in which we see the best, most characteristic qualities of both instruments at a premium, the so-called money register of the horn, in which its most epic, poetic, and memorable melodies and featured parts have been scored. This is also true for the tenor trombone in its own way, for while it's not as soloistic an instrument as the horn, at least in the main concert repertoire to date, its strongest and richest notes still lie across this range, showing up in parts from the subtle to the truly terrific. And while it maintains many of these qualities as it ascends into its high register, the continuing compression of overblowing at embouchure, added to the characteristics of the cylindrical bore, lead to an ever more intense, sometimes strained sound, with less of the middle register's awesome wealth of tone. Meanwhile, the top register of the horn sounds ever more individual, with a kind of superhuman heroicism, clear and ringing over the orchestra when appropriately scored to the player's best abilities. Taken all in all, then, what are the best pitches for matching up trombone to horn? I would say probably the 2 octaves between the lowest notes of the trombone's middle register and the highest notes of the horn's middle register, concert A3 to A5. Here you'll get the best out of this timbral combination, though the orchestrator must be aware that horn has a tendency to drop in projection from octave to octave downwards, especially comparing it to heavy brass instruments. The Rimsky-Korsakov equation of balancing one trombone with 2 horns will work for most of this range, though one might require an additional horn on the lowest notes if they're really quite loud. Reaching into the high range of both instruments is still possible, and can produce a quite dramatic and convincing effect. But perfection of balance may only work with top players, and if one-on-one, when the trombone is marked down dynamically by 1 or 2 degrees. A quick comparison between spectrographs of trombone and horn pitches at mezzo forte on G below middle C is quite revealing. The horn's wonderful roundness of tone is revealed in the strong second and third partials in its body of tone, not to mention that spike on the fifth partial, which imbues it with a lot of colorful resonance. The trombone, on the other hand, has a more powerful root tone, a slanting upward from its body of tone to its fifth and sixth partials, and then a more radiant sheen of tone from there, with an increased intensity of higher partials. Overlaying the two graphs, we can see how the greater regularity of strength in general of the trombone will result in a brighter, punchier tone, which cuts across the horn's subtler dips and gaps. These disparities just become more and more pronounced with stronger and stronger dynamics, making the 2-to-1 equation ever more justified. Here at the end of Mahler's First Symphony, for instance, in an extraordinary coda section, fortissimo first and second trombones play a repeated fanfare motif, harmonized in intervals. These pitches are doubled by fifth trumpet on top and fourth trombone below. In order to blend these heavy brass pitches in a near-perfect balance, Mahler doubles fifth trumpet and first trombone with no less than 4 horns, the first, third, and unison fifth and sixth. The lower pitches, played by second and fourth trombone, are doubled by second, fourth, and seventh horn. This is why I call it near perfect rather than perfect, as 4 horns below as well as above would have been ideal. But Mahler does what he can with his 7 horns, bringing in third and then second bassoon for additional horn-adjacent tone weight. The end result is a seamless blending of horn and trombone tone that rips along frantically to the last bars. Before we get too far into complex scoring, let's see how some of the basics work that I mentioned in my chart from 100 orchestration tips. We see toward the end that octave combinations are immensely serious, and that chordal unisons can sound dark. There's a great example of this at the start of Movement 4 of Schumann's Fourth Symphony, in a passage that looks forward to the epic majesty of late Romantic composers, like Wagner and Bruckner. Notice that the dynamics aren't specified, but the quality of articulation is markiert, well marked, or marcato. Against the softness of the accompaniment, the horns and trombones don't really need to play all that forcefully to be noticed. As to balance, Schumann starts with alto and tenor trombones in unison at the top of the octave, with bass trombone below, but then drops the tenor down to double the bass in the second phrase. Above, we see octave horns playing along, just a pair for now, though here's a place where a bumper might well thicken up the top pitch to help balance with the top line of the trombones. On the third statement, we really hear a few bars that probably inspired Wagner. An F chord alternating with B flat and then back, with bass trombone covering the root. Alto and tenor trombones playing thirds in the middle, and the horns on fifths and sixths above. Here, Schumann, who some people think isn't supposed to be that great of an orchestrator, shows that he understands what he's doing quite well. Over the trombones in their middle range, the horns balance nicely in their upper register. This is followed by a mighty double octave on sounding A, with the trumpets taking the upper position over double D and F horns below. Despite this ominously building blast of strength, notice how effectively the horn and trombone octaves answer going forward with their own octave A's. A darker, throatier sound. Without breaking down the chorale too much at the end, I'll at least observe the fascinating element of that highest note of D in alto trombone and third horn, diving down a fifth to join up with first horn and first trumpet on G and then A at the end. Another combination I mention on the chart is the concept of integrated scoring. Though I illustrate this harmonically, it can be equally effective with motion in the parts, especially at very soft dynamics in which both instruments can achieve a better balance without worrying so much about bulking up the horns. For a great illustration of this, let's stick with Schumann. In another opening of another fourth movement, this time of his Third Symphony. Here we observe a perfectly balanced blend of first horn with alto trombone. A unison I feel is so much more ideal than horn plus tenor, especially going all the way up to doubling that top C on E-flat horn, sounding E-flat 5, with greater subtlety and sensitivity, considering the extraordinary effort that the horn player is going through to temper the dynamics up there. With this radiant but somber line on top, both groups of instruments form a four-part chorale, the bass trombone doubling first bassoon and pizzicato cellos as one might expect. But more interestingly, with the two inner voices of second horn and second trombone beautifully balanced at pianissimo and completely independent of one another. Notice the role of third horn, adding a little extra polyphony here and there, and a bit of unison to reinforce the first horn part in the middle of the passage. It's a great example of the possibilities inherent in these instruments, with a lot of imagination, craft, and restraint. A very similar chorale of integrated horns and trombones occurs at the start of Bruch's Scottish Fantasy, though very much reflecting the leap forward of a full generation of Romantic period scoring, with two tenor trombones rather than a tenor and an alto. Bruch, unlike Schumann, feels that the parts should be doubled as much as possible rather than independent, resulting in an even darker and richer combination of tones. Only occasionally does he expand certain voices here and there to moments of independent motion, and ultimately, all voices telescope down to a simple E-flat minor root triad, with tuba adding the root an octave below. And speaking of which, that tuba plays a role here in further rounding out the tone, mostly playing in octaves with bass trombone, both doubled by bassoons. The color is as grave and solemn as could be. Of course, horns and trombones don't always have to be so dark and funereal. As we've seen in my ongoing Carmina Burana score analysis series, the combination can be quite fun and even joyous. You may have already watched my video covering the instrumental Tanz, in which four horns team up in unison with two tenor trombones, blasting out a fortissimo melody over timpani and strings. The math here is completely in line with Rimsky-Korsakov's 2-to-1 balance between horns versus heavy brass and louder dynamics, and the phrase really roars. Earlier this month, I released an analysis video covering the later song Estuans Interius, from the In Taberna section of Carmina Burana, that includes this boisterous bit of scoring, unison A minor triads and horns and trombones. Aware of the inherent imbalances, Orff scores the trombones down to mezzo piano under the horns forte, and bolsters the root of that chord with unison second and fourth horns. The result is something like this, if you'll excuse the note performer mock-up. Later on, Orff reuses this combination, strengthening the trombone's dynamic to mezzo forte, and stacking trumpets on top of that. The overtones from the trombones and horns on the bottom enrich the trumpets on top to a quite energized, excitable sheen that does well enough without needing further doubling by horns or winds. I've linked both videos below, so you can go watch the full analysis with even more context and revelations about instrumental color and balance. But before you go, let's finish up with a little score study, featuring the framing music of this video, the fourth movement of Bruckner's 8th Symphony, in its first version. The opening of the movement is as solid as it is fiery. 8 horns playing in different combinations with trombones and tuba, in massive octaves, blazing harmonies, and heroic thematic gestures. I've set things up so you can score read the first 39 bars along to some audio, and there's yet another link below to a full score plus audio version on YouTube if you want to study the whole symphony, which is definitely worth a look for its large-scale orchestration and the use of Wagner tubas galore. Check all that out, and I'll see you again soon with more tips, score study, and resources.